Hey, remember this chapter is on the somatic nervous system. So far, everything we've covered was the sensory somatic nervous system. We do have about 9 or 10 slides at the end on the motor portion of the somatic nervous system. Remember, this is the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscles, which we consciously decide to control. Consciously sort of falls apart a bit with breathing because we don't have to think about breathing, but we can if we want. We can breathe faster if we want to, right? But if you're not thinking about it, it's just going to happen anyway. So that's where this consciously sort of falls apart a little bit. And also your procedural memory, for example, things that you do that you don't have to think about anymore because you've done them so often, walking, talking, that kind of thing. It's still somatic motor nervous system because it's going to skeletal muscles. It's just that, yeah, you probably did have to consciously decide to do it once, but once you learn it, you don't have to anymore. That's called procedural memory. Memory way different than declarative memory, recalling facts and events, right? That's has nothing to do with this chapter. So motor responses, where do they start? In the frontal lobe. We learned this last chapter. More specifically, the primary motor cortex. That's the beginning of the pathway. Remember that homunculus with all those distorted pictures of parts of the body? So that's on your frontal lobe, that primary motor cortex. Remember, we have a premotor cortex, which is the planning area, and that primary motor cortex is where that motor response, somatic motor, begins, that will end at the effector, which is the skeletal muscle. Recall your primary motor cortex is on your precentral gyrus. So it starts with these cells, right, where that thought of doing something, moving, using your skeletal muscle, that thought begins right there, right, when you decide to take some sort of action. And those cells are called Betz cells or pyramidal cells, spelt like pyramidal or pyramidal cells. So there's the pathway, right? These neurons, which we call upper motor neurons because they're mainly in the central nervous system, goes down your brain. And remember, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa, right? So these axons are going to have to cross somewhere. They usually do in the medulla. There's the crossing over from right to left here. The word for crossing over is decussation, right? Decussation, these are pyramids. That's what the area of the medulla is called, decussation of pyramids. So you have crossing over to the other side, and then eventually this will go to the level of the spinal cord where it will eventually exit to get to a specific muscle. But there's your upper motor neuron, which exists beginning with the pyramidal cell body, and it will run all the way, decussate or cross over, right, and down into the spinal cord. All right, now that upper motor neuron that travels down the spinal cord is eventually going to synapse in the ventral horn, the somatic motor area in red, the ventral horn somewhere in your spinal cord. Where? Is it more towards C3 or is it more towards T6, right? It just depends on which muscle is being which muscle is the effector in this case. So at some point in your spinal cord, that upper motor neuron will synapse with a lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron will begin at the ventral horn, and then it'll go through this ventral root, become the spinal nerve, and then you'll have a ventral ramus or dorsal ramus to go towards the muscle that is the effector. So with somatic motor, you have an upper motor neuron that's in the central nervous system, that's a tract. And then a lower motor neuron begins in the ventral horn, and then we'll go to the effector, which is the skeletal muscle. Here's just another picture that actually shows a muscle. Of course, the muscle fibers are the individual cells. This happens to be a fascicle right here, just a group of muscle fibers. On the lower motor neuron, you can see begins in the ventral horn, out the ventral root, spinal nerve, right? And this is the lower motor neuron, which will terminate and synapse at a neuromuscular junction, which we know that from previous chapters. And there's your effector, which is the skeletal muscle that gets activated by this lower motor neuron. Reflexes involve skeletal muscles, and that's what these final slides are about, are reflexes. We're going to go through the 5 steps of the reflex arc. just know that reflexes do not need the brain. It's a message that goes into the spinal cord, sensory, and then out, motor, out of the spinal cord to an effector skeletal muscle. And that's a way sometimes to protect ourselves from injury, where by the time information would get to the brain to make a decision, it would be too late. So we have all these reflexes that occur where we're just using information going in and out of the spinal cord for speed. And that's what a reflex is. And there's 5 steps to a reflex, which we call a reflex arc. And we're going to go over these 5 steps on the picture on the next slide. Well, it looks like something happened. It looks like a nail is going into someone's skin, or maybe someone putting their hand on a hot stove, right? It was another good example of some type of stimulus. Well, something unwanted is happening. So number 1, first thing you need is a receptor, a mechanical receptor usually, or if it's a hot temperature, it would be a thermoreceptor. Whatever receptor is picking up the stimulus, that's step 1. A receptor is going to be sensitive to that noxious or unwanted stimulus. So what's the receptor have to do? Send an action potential or an impulse down a neuron, but what kind of neuron? Since we're going towards the central nervous system, spinal cord's part of the central nervous system, we call that a sensory neuron or afferent neuron. So step 2, sensory neuron or afferent neuron delivers the information or the impulse to the CNS, in this case the spinal cord. Step 3 is our integration center, and that is a neuron entirely inside the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord. We call it an interneuron. Interneurons are integrative neurons, and it's going to receive a message through the synapse from the sensory neuron. It's going to decide which motor neuron to use to respond to that stimulus that was unwanted. So the interneuron, entirely within the central nervous system, synapses with number 4, motor neuron, also called an efferent neuron, will then synapse at this neuromuscular junction to an effector, which is step 5, effector, which will be the skeletal muscle. So we should know those in order: receptor, then sensory or afferent neuron, integration center or interneuron, motor or efferent neuron, effector or skeletal muscle. So we just looked at, on that reflex arc, a withdrawal reflex, meaning there's a part of the body in danger, and that reflex allows you to remove it in time before too much damage is done, hopefully. Example, like I said earlier, removing a hand from a hot stove. When that happens, when you have a withdrawal reflex to move your hand away, whatever the effector is, let's say it's the biceps brachii muscle, well, there's always going to be something called reciprocal inhibition. So example, the biceps muscle is activated to remove the hand. Well, with reciprocal inhibition, at the same time, the antagonist muscle, which happens to be the triceps brachii muscle, is inhibited. And you have something called Golgi tendon organ. That's a receptor inside the muscle belly. So then when the biceps contracts forcibly, the triceps relaxes. And the reason why this reciprocal inhibition happens is by relaxing the antagonist muscle, it allows for a much stronger contraction of the prime mover. So if we're trying to remove our hand from the hot stove, the bicep muscle is going to be much more powerful if the triceps is relaxed. And that's what this receptor does, the Golgi tendon organ. It knows that's happening and inhibits the opposite muscle, which is reciprocal inhibition. Opposite muscle would be the antagonist muscle in this case. Next, a stretch reflex is the fastest reflexes we have in our body because number 3 of the reflex arc is eliminated. The interneuron is not there, so there's only 4 steps, meaning the sensory neuron will synapse directly with a motor neuron. And the muscle spindle is the receptor that begins a stretch reflex arc. And these are for example, the knee-jerk reflex, it's called a tendon reflex. When you tap a tendon, like in your knee, in this case, your quadricep muscles will contract. That's because by tapping a tendon, you stretch the muscle. That little tap stretches the muscle. And the muscle spindle is the receptor that picks up that stretch and contracts that muscle right away. Right, so these are the quickest reflexes that we have, stretch reflexes, which are tendon reflexes like our knee-jerk reflex. Quickest because step number 3, doesn't say it here, but we should know, yeah, step number 3 is eliminated. There is no interneuron. No interneuron, one less synapse meaning a quicker reflex. So here's an example of a stretch reflex, the knee-jerk reflex. If you tap this tendon, push in on this tendon, well, this is going to pull on the muscle. Pulling on the muscle stretches the muscle. We have receptors in our muscle bellies called muscle spindles. The spindles get stretched, right? So the spindles are the receptor. Step number 2, sensory neuron. And the sensory neuron synapses directly with a motor neuron to the effector to contract it, which would bring the leg up. So you can see there's no here there is an interneuron, but on the stretch reflex right here, there is no interneuron. It goes right from sensory to motor. Now at the same time, this is part of the reflex arc. You do have an interneuron to a motor neuron, but this is going to inhibit the antagonist. So this is showing us here reciprocal inhibition. This contraction can be a lot stronger if we relax the antagonist muscle, in this case the hamstrings. The Golgi tendon organ would be the receptor responsible for reciprocal inhibition, which would be located in the tendon itself. And lastly, we're going to look at something called a crossed extensor reflex. That's when you have a withdrawal reflex. Withdraw meaning move your hand away from a hot stove or take your foot off a nail that you're stepping on, right? Those are to protect you, withdrawal reflexes. But with a withdrawal reflex, you have a crossed extensor reflex going on at the same time. That means the opposite thing is going to happen on the other side of the body so you can maintain your balance. You could read through this, but I'm going to explain everything on the next and final slide. Now this could have been anything, hand on a hot stove, foot stepping on a nail, whatever the stimulus is, there's your receptor picking it up. You don't actually see the receptor, step 1. Step 2 would be sensory or afferent neuron. Step 3, interneuron, happens to be more than one interneuron here. Remember, this is not a stretch reflex, this is a withdrawal reflex, so there is all 5 steps to the reflex arc. Number 4 in red is motor neuron or efferent neuron, and then the effector is the bicep muscle that flexes the flexes the forearm at the elbow, which removes your body from danger in this case. What happens at the same time when the biceps muscle is contracted? We want the triceps muscle to relax. We call that reciprocal inhibition. Well, let's see how that happens. Receptor, sensory or afferent neuron, interneuron, but let's take this purple route. This motor neuron, well, this motor neuron is going to inhibit, you can see a little minus sign there instead of a plus, is going to inhibit the triceps muscle. So this way our biceps muscle can contract more forcibly to take, in this case, your forearm away from danger. That's stuff we know so far. That's the withdrawal reflex, and that's reciprocal inhibition. But what's happening on the other side of the body? Well, you have an interneuron that goes across this gray commissure, right, to the other side of the body, and look what's happening. And on the other side, the elbow or forearm is being straightened or extended opposite of the withdrawal reflex. This helps you maintain your balance. So what's happening on one side, you do the opposite on the other side. And that makes more sense in the legs, because if you have to take your foot off a nail that you're stepping on, it'd be good if your other leg did the opposite action so you don't fall over. All right, so on the withdrawal reflex, the biceps is activated or contracted, the triceps is relaxed. Well, the opposite happens on the other side of the body. So in this case, biceps brachii muscle in red, you see the minus sign, is inhibited, but the plus sign where the purple motor neuron is activating the triceps brachii muscle. Okay? So that would be the cross extensor reflex. So cross extensor means on the opposite side of the body, the opposite actions happen on the two muscles in question.